Well, thanks everybody for being here. This is a really important topic, an important discussion, and an important time to have it at the beginning of a new administration. From the anarchy of the Great Depression emerged Roosevelt's Reciprocal Trade Agreements program, leading to Bretton Woods, the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade, Tariffs and Trade, and an era of successive trade rounds. That era, I think, indisputably, I would say indisputably, has come to an end. And I think it's right to say that the WTO is established as the lead standard bearer of open trade rules and enforcer of those rules, but it is also obvious that the means of expanding trade-freeing commitments under those rules, massive rounds like the Doha round, which engages all 158 now WTO members, have simply failed and have nil promise of being revived anytime soon. Since the start of the Doha round 10 years ago, the world of commerce has dramatically changed. Today, we will discuss whether existing free trade rules and the means of negotiating them can take into account the reemergence of state capitalism, the increasing servicification or integration of manufacturing with services. Linda's wincing, but that's okay. The digitization of global cross-border trade, and the need to retool people who are displaced by trade and to rebuild our human capital, which is our essential competitive edge. So every member of this panel is expert and seasoned in these issues, and I'm very pleased to introduce, to start, Linda Dempsey. Linda is Vice President of International Economic Affairs at the National Association of Manufacturers. She is a former Vice President of the Emergency Committee for American Trade and a former trade counsel for the Finance Committee in the Senate. Next, Brad Jensen is a member of the faculty of the McDonough School of Business, a senior scholar at the Center for Business and Public Policy there. He is a fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the author of Our Services Bible, Global Trade and Services, Fear, Facts, and Offshoring. Next, Howard Rosen is a resident visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and executive director of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Coalition. Previously, he was minority staff director of the Joint Economic Committee and executive director of the Competitiveness Policy Council. And Bill Reinsch is president of the National Foreign Trade Council, also a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Previously, he served as Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration and worked for many years in the Senate, where I first knew him, as counsel to Senators Rockefeller and Hines. So I'd like to follow the order as above and begin with Linda Dempsey. Linda, thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I think so. Thank you, Bob, and to the Center for having us all here today. This is a really important topic and something I spend all of my time on over at NAM. And for an organization with about 12,000 members throughout the United States, we have everybody from those small members with less than 25 companies. In fact, they make up the small and medium-sized part of our membership, is the greatest part of our membership, to the very large companies that, that's better? Okay. The very large companies, be they U.S. headquartered companies that are name brands here in the United States, to foreign-owned companies that manufacture here in the United States for a variety of reasons. We care very much about the international trading system and want to advance our members' interests. Bob had asked me to start the talk today with a little bit of a background on trade and the numbers, although you yourself gave a very nice background. And each of you have this handout at your seats. And so I'll just sort of talk through that and add some points. I do not read PowerPoint slides, so read along if you'd like. Bob talked about the development of the GATT back then with about 23 countries as members, a world average of 40%, but that then was misleading, as is the number today, in terms of tariffs on many of the heavily traded products and products where one would like to see new market share. The WTO came into force in 1995 and didn't just deal with tariffs, of course. It had brought on all the other successive pieces of the GATT and the successive rounds and codes, and covers many new issues, no longer new to us today, but services, intellectual property protection. All of these important to employers, companies here in the United States, and the workers. And the membership of the WTO, obviously much larger than the original GATT, but it too has grown substantially. And you said 157, maybe 58. I had 157.
Laos came in yesterday.
Yeah, see, I didn't see that. I was looking at the number with our good friends in Russia, and thanks to all of the members of Congress up here who approved permanent normal trade relations with Russia. The world average tariff, as a result of all these successive rounds, has really been reduced. It's 4%, again, a bit misleading. We see in the manufactured area closer to 12%, and then, of course, there's all the non-tariff barriers. But if you turn to the next slide, you'll see that as the trading system has grown, so too has trade, and it has really skyrocketed, particularly from the 1970s onward. And U.S. trade, if you turn to the next slide, it too has grown, and here I've broken out manufactured goods, which is the bottom segment of this graph, followed by, above that, the thinner line is merchandise exports. That's things like food commodities, agricultural products, some energy products. And then look at the growth of services that I know Brad is going to spend a lot more time on. But it is, in general, a really important trajectory up. 2009 was a tough year for everyone. And as much as we see exports growing, and I didn't put this information in because I didn't have it as handily on services, we've seen exports growing since 2009. It was a particularly low point. But kind of slowly, and I didn't get I was traveling last week, so I didn't get the October year-to-date figures in, but we were about 5% growth in 2012 in terms of exports, which is awfully low and quite concerning going forward. There's all sorts of numbers and configurations you can look at when you think about trade, and as I told Bob, I didn't put in my international investment numbers on this, and hopefully there'll be another presentation that Bob and the center will have on that, because that is hugely important. But I think it's also interesting to look at the share of world trade, and you'll see that in the pie charts that follow. The United States started out with about 20% in 1948. Not surprising for a lot of reasons. The UK was huge. Jump forward to 2011, which of course misses Japan really rising and then slowing down in terms of its share of trade. But obviously, the and Germany too really increased in the 80s. But now the United States and Germany and many of the other European countries are on a decreasing share, about 8% for the United States of world trade. And look at the new entrants, particularly China, which is the biggest of them. Look at India, which has decreased over time. A very interesting development. But you can also look at the other segment, which too has grown. So there's more countries that are involved in trade overall, and that's a good thing from our perspective. Another important point to consider is that the U.S. as an exporter is actually quite much less export intensive than other major countries around the world, particularly Germany or Japan or many of the European countries. And this chart, this only goes up to about 2010, but really shows that trajectory of who has grown on trade and who hasn't as a share. Bob mentioned where the WTO has gone with all the rounds, and obviously I think everyone in this room knows that Doha is no longer moving along at full speed ahead. I won't characterize its current status. But what we do see is a growth in regional trade agreements, and this is from the WTO Secretariat. And we all know this, we've heard about this. But it is a different model, one that some believe can complement, can push the WTO forward, and others believe is very destructive to the WTO. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about that. I'll take a few more minutes because I want to save a lot of time to hear my colleagues, but also to engage in a dialogue with you all. What do we see next globally and outside the global WTO arena? For manufacturers, we are looking at the WTO, and we are very excited by the ability and hope that we can move forward on the separate customs and trade facilitation talks. And for manufacturers and for those who send goods overseas, bring inputs or bring finished product into the United States, dealing with customs is hugely important. It's time, it's money, it's paperwork, and in many, one of the problems many of our companies see overseas is corruption. And so the stronger rules-based system you can have on this, huge gains. And I remember PIIE had done a study maybe 2 years ago that really showed what would be the gains out of finishing a few things in the Doha round, and customs and trade facilitation was huge. Information technology, there is, as many of you know, an effort to expand the information technology agreement that was completed in 1996 at the Singapore WTO ministerial, the first ministerial. We as manufacturers obviously produce a lot of that equipment, but even more important, manufacturers outside of the information communications technology, ICT realm, are huge users, and this has really helped expand productivity, how you get goods across markets. There's a lot of new issues, and I think Bill's going to talk about things like cross-border data flows. But this is the information technology talks are hugely important to ourselves, not just for the gains to producers and consumers, but could this be, to use an APEC word, a pathfinder? Could we see something start on information technology, and could we use that to go into some of the other areas where we still have huge tariffs, where perhaps countries could see real value in reducing tariffs? Things, I think about goods needed to expand infrastructure or something like that is something that we'd see a lot of value in. And services, hugely important. Couldn't agree with Bob or Brad more on the importance of services to manufacturers. We couldn't be there without you. We couldn't expand without you, and I sort of think you guys need us too. So we're very supportive. What next outside the WTO? The Trans-Pacific Partnership talks. 11 countries, hugely important for manufacturers in the United States, that Canada and Mexico are now part of these talks. There's a lot of integration, as many of you know, in supply chains, particularly in North America. That's a huge and important development. It could be a great template, could bring in other countries in the Asia Pacific. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'll mention that at the end. Also looking at the potential US-EU talks. For manufacturing, there's about $6.5 billion in tariffs that the EU imposes on our goods going out of the United States. Be nice to deal with that, but what it really would be most important to deal with are the non-tariff barriers, be they sanitary, phytosanitary barriers that affect my food processors as well as our agricultural community, technical barriers, different standards. Some of these probably can be dealt with more easily, the new standards that are being developed, say electric cars or things like that. But we've got a whole history of very difficult standards, and we would really like to see progress on that, because it really is a cost and a barrier to our ability to expand into the EU. I didn't bring the facts and figures, but the United States is like the third largest supplier to the EU in goods. The EU is the biggest supplier into our market. Other trade agreements, knitting together existing trade agreements, all things we're going to look at. There's a nice little chart here. What are the challenges that manufacturers face? These are really serious issues. I could spend an hour on each of them, but I won't. You can read about them. And so how do we bring these opportunities to meet these challenges? And we've got to get moving on these trade agreements. We've got to have a much more robust, unified trade agenda. And from our perspective, we need Congress to be involved. We need Trade Promotion Authority. Last renewed in 2002. The world has changed. There certainly was an iPad. I don't think there was an iPhone back then. We need Congress and the stakeholders, but particularly those of us in business, but everyone, to join in and really look at what we as a nation need to do on international trade. So let me stop there.
Good, thank you very much, Linda. Brad, you want to go ahead?
Great. Stop now.
While you're ahead.
However, in spite of that warm reach out and shout out from NAM, yeah, I think that there's still a lack of appreciation for the big opportunity that exists for the global trading system and for the United States in the area of liberalizing trade and services. I think most people readily acknowledge that the United States is a service economy. But in a lot of my conversations, we too readily turn from that to, yeah, but how is growth in exports going to help revive the manufacturing sector? Not that that's wrong. Not that that's not an important thing that we want to see happen. But I think by having that focus, we miss another big opportunity, and that's services. So services is so big that I'd like to restrict it a little bit and talk about what I'll call business services. This is what the government statisticians put in the North American Industrial Classification System, industries that start with 5. So it's the information sector, which includes software publishing, newspaper publishing. It includes telecommunications, media industries, internet stuff. There's finance and insurance in the NAICS 50s. There's professional, scientific, and technical industries. So this is attorneys, accountants, architects, engineers, and there's also administrative support. That sector, that business service sector, while it sounds kind of niche, accounts for 25% of employment in the United States. In contrast, the manufacturing sector accounts for 10% of employment in the United States. So this business service sector is 2.5 times the size of the manufacturing sector. It's not to say that manufacturing is not important, but it's just to say that business services are also important and warrant policy attention. I think that people still don't walk around with the right picture in their head of what the U.S. economy looks like. So just to put a little sharper point on this, you know, in the most recent presidential election, we heard a lot of talk about the automobile industry and how important it is. I grew up in Detroit, so I know, you know, the automobile industry is an important industry. You know, motor vehicles and parts, so NAICS Industries 3361, 3362, and 3363 employ about 910,000 people, so close to 1 million people. Engineering services, NAICS 541330, engineering services. How big could that be? It employs 980,000 people, so more people than the automobile and parts industry. Okay, at average wages that are significantly higher than the average wages in the automobile industry. Aerospace is often held up as another important manufacturing industry, and it is. Aerospace and parts employs about 440,000 people. If I look at computer system design, NAICS 541510, it employs 1.25 million people, 3 times the size of the aerospace sector. Again, at higher average wages. Okay, so I think, you know, we need to reorient how we think about our economy. Services don't mean burger flipper jobs. There are a lot of really good services jobs. This business service sector that's 2.5 times the size of the manufacturing sector, average wages in business services are 20% higher than average wages in the manufacturing sector. Okay, so I think it warrants policy. It shouldn't be privileged. I'm not arguing for being privileged. I'm just saying that, you know, we ought to give mind share to thinking about business services. Okay? What's also important about these business services is that they're tradable. A lot of the activity in that sector is tradable. Now, the official statistics are woeful when it comes to measuring the service sector. Okay, services account for about 30% of US exports. Merchandise trade accounts for the other 70%. For that 70% that's merchandise trade, we have over 10,000 product categories where trade statistics are published to every country in the world monthly. For the 30% of trade that's services, we have about 30 categories. Okay, and data becomes available quarterly for a small subset of countries. Okay, so we don't really know what's going on in trade and services, and I would appeal to those of you here who can push on this. We need better services data. Okay. In the book that Bob mentioned, I try to develop a methodology to identify what's tradable or not using available data. And what I find is that a big chunk, more than half of the activity in that business service sector is traded within the United States and thus could be, in principle, traded internationally. Okay, and maybe that's not surprising if you stop and think about it. A lot of software production is tradable. Engineering services are tradable, right? R&D services, project management services, satellite services, right? All these things can be digitized and traded, okay? What's really interesting about this tradable service sector, though, is how different it is than either non-tradable business services or the manufacturing sector. Workers in this tradable business service sector are twice as likely to have a college degree and more than twice as likely to have an advanced degree. So these are really skill-intensive activities. Okay. It turns out that lines up well with U.S. skill abundance. The U.S. is still a skill-abundant place, so we have comparative advantage in producing these activities. The U.S. consistently runs a trade surplus in services. Okay, we have comparative advantage in these activities. We consistently run a surplus, and the surplus has grown over time. Okay. Yet, in spite of having comparative advantage, having globally competitive service firms, having a trade surplus in services, when we look at export engagement by U.S. service firms, it lags significantly the manufacturing sector. So if we look at how much output of manufacturing that's produced in the U.S. is exported, it's about 20%. About 20% of U.S. manufacturing output is exported. In these tradable business services, only 4% of output is exported. Okay, so that lags. If I looked at the share of firms that were engaged in exporting, the ratios are about the same. Okay, so there's a significant lag in services. Now, some of this could be due to culture and language, which may loom larger in these service industries. But I think that there is a big policy impediment to trade and services that is impeding U.S. service exporters. And that is impediments in big, fast-growing emerging markets. So quantifying the barriers, the impediments in services trade is quite difficult. It's not tariffs. So we can't talk about how much the average tariff has changed or how big the average tariff is in services trade. It's not tariffs that are the impediment. It's domestic regulation. It's licensing requirements or accreditation requirements. I think about if you're an attorney in the United States. To practice law in 2 different states, you need to pass the bar in 2 different states. So that's the kind of impediment that we're talking about. In some countries, you need commercial presence. You need to have a local branch to provide architectural services. Yet you also need a license to have a local presence. So there's this kind of catch-22 where you need to be there, but they won't let you in. Okay? So estimates of the World Bank are that impediments in these big, fast-growing markets are 7, 8 times the level of the impediments in the United States. So I think that the announcement yesterday by the administration that they are going to pursue an international services agreement to try to liberalize services is overdue and a big step in the right direction. I think there are, quibbles with the ISA, but I think it is, an acknowledgement that this is really important, that we're paying more attention to it, and there's more work to do. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Howard?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Bob, for asking me to join this crowd. I'm always a little bit nervous when I'm on a panel with Bill Reinsch because I have such great respect for him that
this is before he tears me into little pieces.
yeah, I have such great respect for him that I'm always afraid I'm going to say something that I'm going to over-exaggerate, my normal way that I over-exaggerate, and I'll get an email tomorrow telling me to calm down. So I'm going to, with that in mind, I'm going to try to behave myself today. About 20 years ago, I was involved in a project looking at saving in the United States. In fact, Bob was actually involved in that project. And this was at the council, right? And we had some graphs of the U.S. economy. I was briefing an undersecretary of the labor on these graphs. And she looked down and she said to me, asked me, why is it that economists always start their graphs in 1974? Which is, at that time, was pretty correct. And I said, well, because there were these structural changes that took place in the economy at that time. And so it's not really relevant to kind of compare it to the before 74, but it's really relevant to look after. And she said, well, she always thought it was because that was the year she had her divorce. The reason I thought about this anecdote is because I'm going to be talking about the graphs, the color graphs that I've passed out. I'm going out on a limb here, going far out on a limb here, but I believe that we are in the midst of the kind of structural reforms that we saw in 1974. And I think we are not, we haven't yet realized it, and these things you tend not to realize until you look back. But I believe we are really in the midst of it. And as someone who does this quite often, where I put together data and try to look at and see what it looks like, I got to tell you, you're never as lucky as I was when I put this first graph together. So the first graph, and I'm only going to make 4 points. That's all I'm going to 4 things that I think that are important to keep in mind. So the first one is on the U.S. economy and where we are right now. The first graph, the large areas in the back, that is the share of U.S. economy being spent on investment in plant and equipment. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's it, okay? We need investment in plant and equipment in order to create jobs, to produce goods and services. Before we even get to talk about trade, this is where we make it. And so you see the bottom, the orange area, that's actual plant. And the top, the purple, is equipment and software. It's Brad, okay? And one of the things that's interesting to note is that we have very little need for plant these days. I mean, this is the Steve Jobs story where you can just create a company in your basement or in your garage. It's the equipment and software which is really happening. But what I want you to look at is at the top, the total line of all of them, and you can see and show where we are today versus where we've been over the last 20 years. That despite a rather steep recovery in the last couple of years in investment, we are still significantly below investment in plant and equipment as a share of GDP than we were in 2000. Okay? 2000 is a nice benchmark because at that point we had unemployment at 3.5%, and things were going quite well. And you can just see, even though investment's gone up and down, there's been a secular decline since then. But the line I really want you to concentrate on is the red one, which is the ratio of employment to population. Because of the changes in the economy over the last several years, I would argue that the unemployment rate is no longer the best indicator that you can use to understand what's going on in the labor market, primarily because we have so many people that have been unemployed for so long that many of them have dropped out of the labor market. And so that artificially lowers the unemployment rate because the people in the labor market is the denominator. And so what I have decided to turn to instead is the ratio of, what percent of your working age population are actually working. We don't have to worry about if they're in the labor market or not. And as you can see, there's been a precipitous drop in that ratio during the last 6 years, 5 years, and very little indication of recovery. And this is, for me, the two things I want to point out. This, for me, when you look at that, that makes me think about structural change. Okay? From the 74 to the recent period, we were bringing in the baby boomers and women and people into the labor market on gusto, getting education and bringing them in. It looks like something is radically changing in our labor market. And yes, it could go back up to the historical averages, but there's no indication of it right now. But what I really want you to focus on is the relationship between that line and investment in plant and equipment. Okay? That line, the investment in plant and equipment tended to, or I should say the other way around, the employment to population ratio tended to mirror the investment to GDP up until the recession. The more we invested, the higher the share of the population that was working. And now there seems to be a major gap between those two things. It can be due to a lot of things, which I'm not going to get into today. Maybe if you want, we can discuss them, that we have investment, but we don't need as many people to use that investment in employment and those kinds of things. All of that is what I mean to be a structural change in the U.S. economy. I point this out at this point, in this context, because trade policy in the United States has always been an extension of the domestic economy. It does not sit out there in isolation. And so I think we really need to understand what's going on in the U.S. economy domestically in order to move forward on trade policy. Second point, and these will be much briefer. Trade policies do not dictate trade flows. Sorry to say it, especially to those people like myself who have devoted our entire careers to trade policy. Trade policies are important, but they have very little impact on trade flows. And I show you that graph, which is U.S. exports and imports as a share of GDP over the last 30 years. Maybe I should make this very clear. It has a lot to do with the composition of that trade, who we trade with and what we trade. But it has very little to do with the overall amount of trade. And this is a misconception throughout the world, that trade policy has very little to do with total trade. And in fact, what we see is that imports over the last 20, 25 years have been growing twice as fast as exports have on an annual basis in terms of share of GDP. Next slide. So the question is, what does contribute to U.S. trade, to U.S. exports in particular? Well, when we listen to President Obama give his State of the Union address at the end of the month, there's probably one thing we're not going to hear about, and that is the goal that he set out in 2010 to double exports in 5 years. Because as you see, if you look at the end of this graph, the blue lines is the growth of U.S. exports. We started out very strong. U.S. exports grew at 16% in 2010, the year that he made the goal, set the goal. 13.5% the following year. By the way, exports would have had to grow by 15% each year over the 5 years in order to double. But last year, in 2012, exports dropped. The growth of exports dropped rather strongly and was below 5%. Well, why is that? There are two factors that explain most of the changes in U.S. exports, and that is the growth of world markets, not the United States, but overseas. So that's rest of world growth, and that's the red columns. And then the exchange rate, which is the dark black line that goes through. What you see is that this time, in a very odd way, there was a convenience that as the United States and the world were coming out of the recession, and so there was a pickup in growth, the dollar was depreciating. And so it gave an extra bang and helped U.S. exports, and helps explain why export growth was so big in 2010 and 2011. But, as you can see in the graph, the dollar has leveled off and has even appreciated in some cases, and that has caused a slowdown in U.S. exports. Let me just say that as you can see in this graph, a very small increase in rest of world GDP growth contributes a large increase in U.S. exports. The exchange rate is the second most important variable. So, bottom line is that U.S. exports, as we actually have heard already in different contexts from both Linda and Brad, that U.S. exports are concentrated in markets in which they're of low growth countries. And also the products in which our trade is concentrated in is similarly dependent on markets in countries of low growth. And I've passed out there's a paper over there that you can pick up which goes into more detail and looks at the different markets and products and shows that. And so it would seem to me that the agenda that we have is threefold. One, we have to increase investment in the United States, and we've got to figure out what's going on in the labor market and get more people engaged in the labor market. The second is that we have to do something about the exchange rate. There's very little we can do about rest of world economic growth, but there's a lot we can do about the exchange rate, and we haven't been doing it. And the third is that we have to diversify the goods and services that we sell, that American companies sell to markets. That's where Brad's point comes in. I'm not going to do the next graph because it's a little complicated, and if someone asks me about it, I'll take a minute then. But I can't end my comments without, because I think that's probably why I was really invited here today, to make a plug for trade adjustment assistance. I hope you all know that trade adjustment assistance is a program, a government program that provides assistance to workers, firms, and communities that are adversely affected by globalization. The program has been under attack over the last 15 years. It's been expanded, but also under attack. And I will just say that the program's authorization is going to be expiring soon. And the people are getting into the ditches already for the next battle. And we're going to need a lot of help. Those of you who are working here on the Hill and work in members' offices, these are your constituents. Currently, it's a small program. Only about 200,000 people are enrolled in the program. These data are only for the previous 2 years. I don't have data for the last year. But what is interesting to note is because of the extension of unemployment insurance, less people have been getting their income payments through trade adjustment assistance, rather getting it through unemployment insurance, but they're getting their training through TAA because that is a much better provision of training than we have for all workers. And so what we see, and actually we finally come to what we've been trying to get to for probably the last 30 years, 40 years, is that TAA really is now a training program with a little bit of income maintenance, as opposed to what it's been the other way around. But I would just say that this is going to be coming down the road, and anything that I can do to help you out and your office is out on dealing with that, I would be grateful to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. Bill Reinsch. Now, we're going to stop this program at 1:30 as advertised. And Bill, we're going to ask you to wrap. And
I'm not going to take 40 minutes.
And don't take 40 minutes. But do proceed. We're very eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, the joy of being last, particularly the joy of being last in the House, is I get to dust off that old joke about the Senate as an institution where everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. And I'm in that category. Everything has been said, and I'm going to repeat not much of what Howard said, but I'm going to repeat some other things. And I'm also going to talk mostly about the thing that Howard said was irrelevant, which is policy, because that's what I do, and he may very well be right. But you know, the secret is talk about what you know.
I'm going to get an email tomorrow.
No. I'm going to. I may send you one about the additional graphs you gave me. He gave me a little thing that refers to Bill Reinsch's trade deficit, which he was polite enough not to talk about, but I've got to analyze those things a little more carefully. I'm going to make 6 points, and they really echo the points that a number of the other speakers have made, and they take us back really to where Bob began in terms of how the trading system has changed and what happens next. The first point is simply to note what others have already noted, which is the rapid change from what we used to consider international trade back in the dark ages, when trade was simple. You made it here and you shipped it over there and it was an export, or you made it there and shipped it here and it was an import. Now we are living in a global supply chain world where, in the words of one executive that talked to me, everything is made everywhere. And it creates a much more complicated trading environment, and it creates an environment that's much harder to understand. The classic case that is much talked about, which I have some questions about the accuracy of the analysis, but I think it makes the central point is correct. If you take one of these, for example, this is, under our rules, an import from China, and its retail value is undiscounted. I don't know. In the study, it was like $500, okay? So that amount gets added to the bilateral trade deficit we have with China, which is enormous, and which would be enormous regardless of the story. The actual Chinese value added in this product is $6.50. All the rest of the value of this product came from elsewhere, partly from the United States, the IP, but also the chips. They came from a number of other countries, 5 or 6 or 7, largely Japan, Germany, and I think Taiwan is the other one. So to begin with, I think that illustrates the complexity of the supply chain model. It also suggests that our data doesn't always serve us well in helping us to understand what's going on in the world. If we counted by value added rather than customs rules, and there's a lot of reasons why that would be either hard or stupid, but if we did that, the total global trade balance wouldn't change, I don't think. But the bilateral balances with individual countries would change significantly. The deficit with China would go down. The deficit with a number of other countries would go up. Does that matter? I don't know. My theory is that if you have a better and a more accurate picture of what's happening, you can make better policy. But in any event, a lot of this is driven, in fact, by changes in transportation and communication that allow us to do things that we couldn't do 40 or 50 years ago. When I give a lengthier speech on that subject particularly, I usually tell the story of the 50% then, now 60% of fresh flowers in this country that are imported, something that could not possibly have happened until we had the transportation infrastructure that permitted that. And I did that once in this, I gave a speech in this building, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, that's nothing. We have a company in this case in North Carolina, that catches fish on the Atlantic coast, off the coast of North Carolina, and sells them fresh every day in the Tokyo fish market. This is globalization in its most obvious form. A whole range of things like that I could run through but didn't bring the slides, and similar dramatic changes in cutting the cost of communication and the ability to communicate, and the ability of some countries to leapfrog landline technology and go straight to these, or cheaper versions of these, has been enabling for the development of global supply chain models. So that's the first point. The second point is, as the system has changed, the problems have changed as well. As Linda has pointed out, tariffs are no longer as big a deal as they used to be. Tariff peaks are issues in selected sectors. But in fact, now we're focused on what can loosely be called new issues, or non-tariff barriers. The newest ones, there's some sort of economic models that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but the newest ones are local content, forced localization requirements. If you want to do business with us, you have to build a factory in our country, and you have to source part of your product, if not all of your product, as much as we can negotiate, in our country. Things like that. Intellectual property, forced technology transfer. If you want to do business in our country, you have to enter into a joint venture. You have to share your technology with a joint venture partner. And the odds in some countries are 50-50 that 2 years later he's going to break away from you and start a rival factory down the street and do his best to put you out of business. If you follow the China Commission at all, as Bob said, in which I serve, we've had some very interesting testimony on that. Probably the most interesting one was this kid, actually, who invented a video game called Go-Go Mongo. Has anybody ever played Go-Go Mongo? Probably not. It's for 3-year-olds. But I don't want to make too many presumptions. Mongo is a cartoon monster that eats bad things. And the goal of the game is to get him to eat less fat and sugar and more healthy things so Mongo gets thin. It's a great educational game. This guy was getting hundreds of emails from China about how wonderful this game is and when is the next version coming out, the 2.0 version. So he went back to his marketing guy and wanted to get it, because he sells it all by download. And he wanted to find out what the download picture was for China. And he discovered in the relevant time period, the total number of downloads of his product to China was 1. Yet he was getting hundreds of emails. This is intellectual property protection. And this is the new kind of trade problem that we face. Go-Go Mongo is not exactly a strategic commodity, but it's a good story, and it's symptomatic of the problem. So the problems are different. As the problems have changed, unfortunately, the changes in the trading system and the way we handle these problems have lagged behind the changes in trade. The WTO really was designed, I think, for a different era. It's a consensus-based model, which means change is slow because anybody can object. Even looking at the Doha round, which Linda discussed, you know, the Doha round, even then, is designed to deal with a bunch of issues that are less important than they were then, and is not designed to deal with a bunch of new issues that have come to the fore only in the last 10 years. I remember years ago when Senator Bradley was in the Senate, we had a meeting in the Finance Committee, maybe Linda was there, when he asked the then U.S. Trade Representative that economic integration, global economic integration, was moving faster than political integration. So his question was, how do we accelerate the pace of the latter to match the pace of the former? What, in fact, I think we're moving into now is an era when people are saying, how do we slow down the former in order to match the slow pace of the latter? How do we slow down economic integration because of the dislocations it's causing, some of which Howard talked about? But the third point was that the system is not adjusting fast enough to deal with the new set of problems that we've got. The fourth point is there has been, along with this, and in part the cause of what I just said, a change in the political dynamic. One of the things that the charts and graphs that have been presented here will show you is that the gap between rich countries and poor countries is narrowing. The world is becoming flatter, faster, and closer together. It's also becoming more equal. To digress a minute, interestingly, that says virtually nothing about equality inside an individual country, which is much more a function of that country's domestic economic policy. But trade data demonstrates on a whole host of indicators that the gap between the rich and poor is narrowing. Particularly, you've got now a set of rapidly growing, emerging large industrial economies, Brazil, Russia, China, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa clinging to the back end of that. There are economic problems associated with that, some of which have been discussed by the other panels. The political problem, or the policy problem associated with that, is that these are countries that, for the most part, demonstrate, and in some cases express, their lack of commitment to the international trading system that they remind us periodically they had no part in creating, and which, in the view of many of them, particularly in India, has been the system that has exploited them for the last 50 years. These are not countries that are prepared to, as part of their enhanced economic status, step up and basically do things that are systemically sustaining. And one of the things that one learns in international trade theory is that if you're going to have international organizations that work, you have to have some parties basically that will take one for the team now and then and pay costs that are out of proportion to the benefits that they're accruing from the system in order to maintain the system, and because the long-term benefit of maintaining the system is a public good in itself that is of value to these countries. For the last 60 years, the United States and Europe basically did that, and they were able to do it in part because the costs were relatively small and the systemic benefits were relatively large. I think we are now moving into an era in which those countries are economically unable and politically unwilling to continue to pay that price, and it's a higher price in terms of domestic unemployment and domestic dislocation and the kinds of things that Howard was talking about. It is natural in that kind of systemic evolution for the newly rising powers to pick up part of the burden, and they have been demonstrably unwilling to do so, which is one of the reasons why we've had so much trouble with Doha, but it's one of the reasons we're going to have more trouble going forward in the future. Until we get over that hump, if we can, the system is going to be in a lot of trouble, which brings me to the fifth point, which is adding to that trouble is what you've got now is the spread, limited spread, but still the spread of what can be called, quote unquote, a new economic model. It isn't really new. Chalmers Johnson called it state developmental capitalism when he was talking about the Japanese. But it's a model, whether it involves state ownership, as in China, or state guidance, as in Japan in the 80s. It's a model in which the government takes a much more active role in the economy and takes a role in the economy that is explicitly discriminatory on the trade front. It creates national champions. It does things in terms of domestic economic policy to promote the good health of the domestic national champions, and it aids them in that prospect by making it more difficult for import competition to succeed against them through a variety of means that are the things that have been the occasions of a lot of congressional debate. This started with the Japanese, it spread to the Chinese, the Indians, the Indonesians are beginning to do some of the same things, so are the Brazilians. So, and there's a lesson there, because we're not talking about Mauritania, or Benin, or even the Maldives. We're talking about very large countries with very large markets, and therefore significant market power. And you've got a lot of companies in this country and in Europe who want to sell and invest in those countries because that's where the growth is. And the only statistic that I ever remember is, 95% of the world's consumers are outside our borders. If we want to grow, we've got to trade. The obvious place to trade is in the places where there's a lot of people, and those are these countries. But they are the very ones that are articulating and actually trying to sell to their colleagues an economic model that is very different from ours and has a fundamentally different view of the market than ours does. And that brings me to the last point, which is said with some chagrin, I guess, but I think what all this means is that we are moving into a world where, whereas for the past 60 years we've operated on what is known as the most favored nation principle, MFN, and most of you know what that is, but for those of you that don't, it's the idea that the benefits that you extend to one are extended to all in order to promote the broadest possible trade liberalization. That's a model that I think has served us very well. It may very well be, at this point, a model that is no longer useful, and that we, I think, may be moving into an era where you're going to see at least a two-track WTO, or maybe a multi-track WTO, in which those countries that want to liberalize trade and integrate faster do so, but they do it on a non-MFN basis. They do it in which those countries share the benefits. This is like the government procurement agreement. It's like what may turn out to be the international services agreement. We'll see. And it also relates to some regional or plurilateral agreements, like the TPP, in which some benefits will be restricted to the participants. That may or may not be a good thing in the abstract. That's something that I think Congress will debate. It will particularly debate in the context of negotiating authority for when it takes that up. But I think that the things we've been talking about here lead us inevitably to the conclusion that that's the world we face, and that the system that we've had for the last 60 years, for better or for worse, it no longer meets our needs, and we have to give serious consideration to changing it to a model that is, in a number of respects, very different. Thank you.
Okay. That's a very broad array of views to digest, and I'm sure there are some questions. So who would like to begin? Dr. Welby Lehman. Professor Lehman.
Linda, you mentioned in your graphs that one of the future projects is knitting together existing free trade agreements. So I'd be interested in what you see as the mechanism for doing that, and how would it impact you? The NAM, as I understand it, has a lot of SMEs as members. So can you talk in particular about how knitting together free trade agreements would impact SMEs and their ability to export? And then what's the mechanism for knitting them together? And in particular, is an initiative like the TPP a good expand the TPP a good fit?
That's a bunch of questions. I start with this, with the reaction that we heard almost immediately as Canada and Mexico were joining the TPP. How many of our small guys, in particular medium-sized companies that are exporting to just one or two markets, we're starting to get very excited about this, as well as the companies with these global supply chains. Many of our companies are used to exporting to Canada and Mexico, and seeing that type of seeing Canada and Mexico as part of the TPP actually gave them a great deal of comfort. One of the problems that you face, and it's true for big companies, but it is even more massively true in terms of the many barriers that our small and medium-sized companies have in exporting, is the paperwork, is the differing tariffs, is the differing policies. And all of these trade agreements, I didn't put in the charts in terms of, it's about 40% of U.S. manufactured exports go to our free trade agreement partners. Thank you, all of your offices that have long supported those agreements. It goes to sort of Howard's point about we can change some of the composition. I think trade policy matters greatly, but by eliminating barriers. But to get more of those companies exporting, and we hear from these folks every day about, well, how do I do this? And we work with the Commerce Department and we work with others. So yes, I think there's great ability to expand U.S. export potential, expand opportunities. I think there's a lot of jobs we don't have in the United States because we don't export more in manufactured goods. And obviously it's highly, highly competitive. We're the world's largest manufacturer, but we're no longer the largest manufactured goods exporter. The mechanism, TPP may be it. We are all strongly supportive of seeing a high standard comprehensive agreement by the October meeting in Bali of the APEC leaders. That's sort of the unstated goal. There's a lot of work still to be done, and without the type of trade partnership between the administration and Congress, Trade Promotion Authority, or whatever folks would like to call it, I think it's very hard to achieve that type of high standard agreement in that time frame. One could look at knitting together hemispherically those agreements, starting with our own hemisphere. We've got a lot of them now, with Panama just coming on board, and Colombia, obviously Peru, Chile. You don't want to create too much work out there. There was a great post put out by Ed Gresser today on how few people are involved in trade policy in the executive branch. Most of our trade folks are doing customs work, but it's something to think about if it could be done more easily, if there's a stall in TPP, if some of these other actions don't go forward. But it also takes me back to the customs piece too, because that's where a lot of the problem is. If you had cleaner paperwork, more streamlined processes and procedures, an easy way internationally to see what your tariff rate's going to be on a particular good, that would be greatly helpful. I think I answered everything. I don't know.
Institutions for export promotion or for trade, what kind of?
Both. I mean, so it's seen as promoting, companies from the U.S. getting more companies to be able to export, building out their ability to do so, as well as kind of showing off and building kind of national champions, but not necessarily making it that way. You're giving them a little bit as you also take advantage of the international.
I can tell you work for a Democratic member. Good. I agree with you. This issue was joined when the president came out with his export promotion policy, and I think most of us generally were enthusiastic about the pieces of it. He spent a lot of time talking about facilitating the exports of small businesses and getting more small businesses out there trading. And there's a lot of data, most of it produced by Howard's Institution, which demonstrates that companies that are internationally engaged, as opposed to companies that are not, pay better wages, pay better benefits, get rid of fewer people, and go broke less often. So there's a lot of, over 20 years, there's a lot of data that suggests this. The idea of expanding the universe of exporters is a good one for a lot of reasons. Frankly, my attitude at the time, though, was if you really want to produce a quick return, if you will, bang for the buck, you do what you always do, which is look at where the money is. And the money's at the Export-Import Bank, and that's really the only place it is. This administration has done an exceptionally good job of expanding the scope of the bank's activities. They had an unexpectedly difficult time reauthorizing it this last year, and one of the issues was the cap of how much could be outstanding at any one moment. It was not a reassuring signal to exporters to have that argument because it suggested that, we might very well bump up against it and that a lot of financing wouldn't occur. There was a period of time, largely in the 90s, when a lot of export financing was undertaken directly by banks, and the Export-Import Bank was less important because it was an alternative private market, which frankly everybody prefers. But in the after '09, a lot of people simply got out of that market entirely. The bank, which had authority to loan directly as well as provide guarantees, stepped up and did an extraordinary job of facilitating exports at a moment when nobody else would have been able to do that. It's that, unfortunately, thanks to congressional action, that reauthorization fight is going to pick up again fairly soon because you didn't reauthorize it nearly long enough. So we're going to have this fight all over again, and I would say the single most important thing that the Congress can do is make sure that's done properly and make sure it's done for a long time so we don't have to go through this every couple of years.
All right. I think Brad wants to jump in.
Good.
So just to follow on Bill's point about the desirable characteristics of exporters. So I did a lot of that research, and it's true. Exporters are very different. But you need to be careful because it's not that the exporting made them different. It's the fact that they were different that allowed them to export. Okay, when we look at longitudinal data, and this has been done, we've done the research in the United States, it's been done in lots of other countries, there's very little evidence that exporting confers any kind of additional productivity growth. It's all that the big, good firms can overcome the impediments to exporting. That's why they're the exporters. So public policy to give resources to firms that aren't exporters in the hopes that they will become exporters makes me uneasy. Because there's a market mechanism in place
Right.
that that's what makes the exporters different. And by going and sprinkling money around to the non-exporters, it's not clear to me that you're going to have a desirable effect. And just as a cautionary note, I don't mean to say it's causal, but just as a cautionary note, what we see is that when firms stop exporting, it's associated with lots of bad things. Okay, so That's just,
I just want to make one quick observation, and that is that
Quick. We have to be quick.
well, that just prolonged it. But is that when I first started my career, I had a professor and a mentor who always said that trade in the United States is a residual. We have come a long way in this country in terms of much more engagement and globalization in the world. But exports specifically continues to be a residual in this economy. And it's really a cultural thing. And I'll just say one quick anecdote. I'm obsessed with Groupon and living all these social and all this stuff. I don't know if any of you guys do these things. I buy these things and I get these packages that come in the mail from China with hand addressed. And I had this vision of this person going to the mailbox and mailing my battery recharger that he kind of got in his basement and putting it in the mail to me. Americans who produce things, the cookies that we eat, the potato chips that we eat, they're making it all for here. They never even think about what could I do out there, where in other countries, they think first there and then come home. So that's a cultural thing, which takes a lot of time, but we really need to deal with that. And so, yes, I agree with the government policy and all those things, but it's really a change in people's thinking, that everything I do has to be for the world market.
Okay.
Could I step in here? Yes, XM is hugely important. So are the Commerce Department's export promotion. We work with those folks. Our companies work with those folks on a daily basis. We do far less in the United States than Germany, which is a much bigger exporter, much more export intensive. TDA, Trade and Development Agency. We could talk offline. But what I want to say is, and this picks up on Brad's point, the latest research I've seen is the companies that export are the ones that are successful domestically. So trade used to be a residual. In some sense, it still is. But let's not ignore here that it is 20% costlier to manufacture in the United States than anywhere else in the world. There are domestic policies that impact the success of our companies in services and manufacturing and farming that matter, and they limit. When it makes it more costly to manufacture or produce here, it makes it harder to export.
If I can add one thing on the national champion issue and on the national champion issue, this is a debate we've had in this country on and off for 100 years. Every time I think my side has won, basically the Republicans come into power and we have to start all over again. But the essence of it is, first of all, we're very good at this. If you look at our aerospace industry, if you look at our telecommunications industry, most of this was started in one way or another by the government. We have the most efficient agricultural production industry in the entire world. That was started by the Congress in the 19th century. It was a deliberate act of policy. We want to build this up. We know how to do this, and we do it very well. The politics of it right now suggests that the only way you can get away with it is if you put it under the umbrella of defense and national security. Mm-hmm. And if you call it defense and national security, everybody buys it. That's aerospace. Why do we start radio and telecommunications in the 20s? Because the Navy wanted wireless communication.
Okay.
It's a defense issue.
Maybe we could, a new line of questioning, conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. One, actually,
And who are you with? Tell us about yourself.
I used to go to Georgetown a long time ago. Now went to train my university.
Welcome.
Interesting course. There was a comment about the investment in plastic equipment in this country and the fact that it has been going up a little bit, which normally is related with expectations of growing productivity or lower tax rates. Now we know in this country the tax rates are going down. My question is, there is some debate about bringing back
And the question?
in a right to state. So how do you think about these policies? Because you have to create design services and products in this country competitively to be able to trade it.
I'm not sure what the question is. Go ahead.
I would say in general, that's exactly the point I was trying to make before, that our domestic policies matter. They impact on U.S. success and competitiveness in the global economy. I'm not the labor expert at the NAM. I think if you wanted to get into that domestic policy discussion, I think that's beyond the realm of our discussion here today.
And I do have an exchange rate policy question. I was just curious, what do you think the U.S. could actually do to protect the exchange rate policy?
Well, since I'm going to raise it, I'll say that, increasingly the work that, I didn't begin 30 years ago thinking that the exchange rate was everything. But increasingly, the more work that I do, I see the importance that it plays. And the fact that U.S. policy, stated policy, sometimes actually works against our interests in this area, we need to rethink this. And to make it, very, I'm going to just make a very provocative comment, is that about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was great concern in this country about labor standards and environmental policies. And Barney Frank at an event of my institute said that he was taking trade policy hostage until we addressed those issues. We've made some progress, maybe not to the level that he would have wanted it to be, but I think that it might be time for someone, I know that these guys are going to go apoplectic, but if we're serious about this, I think it's time for someone, a member of Congress, to say, I'm going to take our contributions to the IMF hostage until the IMF plays by its rules. It says that if a country is manipulating its exchange rate, you need to take action against it. This is not something that the U.S. Congress should have to figure out how to do. We have an institution that does that, and it's not doing its job. And so if we're serious about this, I'm not talking about any one administration or any member. We're going to have to stop Mickey Mousing around with trying to figure out what kind of legislation we can get and do something about it, just like we decided to do about labor standards and environment. So okay. But there are things that can be done.
Well, okay, quick.
On
Welcome.
the issue of state-owned resources, I was just curious, understanding that may be country by country specific, what leverage do we have to work with those countries and sort of tapping into those resources or perhaps changing things?
Who'd like to pick that up?
You raised it. SOEs. What resources do we have leverage?
Come on, Bill.
More than we've used, less than I think we'd like. It depends. I think what we've generally done is, and I think where all we can do is a behavior-based approach rather than a definitional-based approach. In other words, they're not bad because they're SOEs. They're bad because of the things that they do. And so you should look at the things they do and decide what your tools are to deal with them. And those tools are different depending on what those things are. There are, in some cases, domestic trade laws that you can use to prevent them from engaging in certain practices in this country. We've been very successful with those. There are WTO litigation things that you can do to prevent them from doing, the government from doing broad policy things that contravene WTO rules. As it turns out, there are actually some things you can do inside of China, in that particular case, and I assume other countries, using their own judicial system, however unsatisfactory that may be, that have some results. I was surprised. We did a road trip there in May, Nanjing to Shanghai, and we met with a bunch of American companies along the way, and in every single one we asked the IP question: have you been a victim of theft or co-option or whatever? And everybody but one said yes. Oddly, interesting, the one that said no said, look, we're number 4 in the marketplace. They're all stealing from number 1. So we don't have a problem.
Doing it too, right?
But what they said that intrigued me is that a number of them said they had had success simply having their lawyers write cease and desist letters to Chinese companies, and that the Chinese companies stopped. I was surprised. I need to learn a little bit more about that. But there are tools. One of the tools that I think is relatively unexplored, Linda might want to comment on this, and it's not applicable in every case, is litigation in in U.S. courts, which you can do particularly on patent cases and a number of other things. There's some very interesting cases, we can do this offline, that have been brought against companies, SOEs or Chinese companies in particular, and in some cases you can argue enormous damages, but I mean, not that you'll collect necessarily, but you can win, and if you win, then you can do other things that make their lives very painful.
Okay.
This is an unexploited tactic.
Just very briefly, an element of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations is a chapter that the United States has tabled, draft chapter on SOEs. It doesn't outlaw SOEs. It says if you're going to have an SOE, fine, you can have it, but it has to behave in certain competitive ways, competitive-friendly ways, a level playing field. So that's one of the reasons why the TPP is, in some quarters, still considered a 21st century agreement. It's the first time that anybody's tried that. And it was a U.S. idea. It was a business community idea. But I'd like to, this is about trade policy, and we've really covered the waterfront, from exchange rate policy to domestic investment, and all of these economic, the economic health of our country is essential to being a good and effective trade partner, trade exporter. But surely, Howard, there are ways in which trade policy can affect our results, let's say, in markets abroad. So if I were the president, and I asked each of you for a memo of three lines, let's say, or to identify, in any case, in writing or whatever, the most important thing I should do to advance United States trade policy. What is the most important, urgent item on the agenda? And who wants to start? You want to go just down the table? Linda.
We need to open markets. We need to make our companies here in the United States globally competitive, and we need to enforce and improve our rules on fairness and a level playing field. And that starts with Trade Promotion Authority. That starts with Congress and the administration working together to create a robust, unified, muscular trade policy.
Good. Dr.
Trust
Jensen.
for services liberalization everywhere and anywhere.
Howard.
So there are only two reasons why we are not going to meet the president's goal of doubling exports in 5 years, and that is because of slow growth in markets that we are operating in and because of the exchange rate working against us. We can't do much about the first. We can do a lot about the second. That's the big enchilada. But if you wanted to get beyond that, certainly second or third best tier, I think that we really do need to start moving into getting our firms into new areas, and services is it.
Okay, Billy.
Short-term, finish TPP, start US-EU negotiations, pass trade negotiating authority.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the session. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it very much. And join me in thanking the panel.